Imagine what would happen if there were no tomatoes. There would be no pizza, no ketchup for french fries, and no chips and salsa, and that's only the beginning. It's the culinary world's unsung hero, used in countless preparations across every single continent. The star of the show, or more often, hiding in plain sight, adding texture and flavor to a huge amount of our favorite foods. But tomatoes almost didn't make it. For hundreds of years, they were rejected by just about everyone, a failure of the Columbian exchange, unwanted in the old world and even said to turn anyone who tried them into witches or werewolves. The story of the tomato is crazy, less about culinary innovation than about religion, superstition, and modern industry. And today we're diving in, chasing the wild history and figuring out how a plant written off as poison somehow found its way to the global forefront. This is the story of tomatoes, today on OTR. In 1883, inflation was out of control in the United States because of high taxes on all foreign imports. Tariffs first put in place to finance the Civil War and then left intact for the next 20 years. With income not keeping up with prices, Americans protested for the tariffs to be lifted, and finally President Chester Alan Arthur gave in, but only part way. See, a lot of his big donors were domestic companies that didn't want competition, so after months of back and forth, the end result was a ridiculous bill that repealed some taxes, raised others, and left some intact. Some other products might be given completely different treatments, like, for example, fruits and vegetables. Basically, imported fruits were now tax-free, and foreign vegetables had to pay a massive tariff. This was good news for American potato and corn farmers, but in western New York, companies growing tomatoes were furious. How could this savory ingredient used in salads possibly be considered a fruit? So to eliminate overseas competition, the farmers sued the federal government, insisting in court that science was wrong and tomatoes were vegetables. It would take 10 years for the case to be decided, but in the end, the Supreme Court agreed. And while to everyone else, tomatoes are fruits, in the United States, it is codified into law that they are not. This would actually prove important in recent history. In the 1980s, the Ronald Reagan administration proposed that ketchup qualify as school lunch as officially healthy, since after all, it's a vegetable. That would expand to include anything in the category, and to this day, according to US law, a slice of pizza is a vegetable, as long as it includes 2 tablespoons of tomato sauce. And we can make jokes about Americans all day long, but the truth is nobody anywhere needed government permission to like ketchup or pizza, or 1,000 other foods that use tomato, because somehow it is the secret ingredient in a huge percentage of a ton of our global favorites. It's there adding fresh sweetness to your hamburger, and giving flavor to marinara, bolognese, and a dozen other kinds of pasta sauce. It's in your tacos, Indian curries, and even Thai somtam. Tomato is the T in BLT, the foundation of Italian caprese and the beloved side dish in the full English breakfast. Without tomatoes, there's no shakshuka, no classic Greek salad, and no West African jollof rice. No pico de gallo, Chinese tomato and egg, or Spanish gazpacho. And while we could keep going, you don't need me to tell you how much we all love tomatoes. A better question is, why? If we go back to that court case, well, it might sound ridiculous now, but in 1883, tomatoes in America were still so new that we didn't really know that much about them. As recently as a couple hundred years ago, the vast majority of people on this planet had probably never tasted a tomato. And if your great-great-grandfather showed up today, well, all those foods we just mentioned would look as foreign and confusing as anything else in our modern world. It took a long time and a lot of twists and turns for mainstream society to accept tomatoes. A lot. Their arrival on the global stage did not come without controversy. It's a long and winding path involving religion, superstition, industrial innovation, and epic characters from one side of the world to the other. Tomatoes have a history unlike any other food. But since there's always a first step in a long journey, well, let's start there, with the very beginning of the story of tomatoes. Before grocery stores sold the stuff we know today, somewhere high in the Andes Mountains of South America, there was a vine growing 20 feet tall, with small fruits the size of blueberries, what we call pimpinellifolium, or pimps if you're a botanist or 13-year-old. Anyway, pimps were edible, technically, but they were extremely sour and tough-skinned, and there's no evidence that early humans did anything with them. Until somehow in today's Ecuador, a new strain would show up, in the rich coastal soil sweeter and bigger, and that's where the story of tomatoes begins. Now, whether it was through human migration or simply animals like birds and giant turtles eating and transporting them, by 5000 BC, tomatoes had reached the Yucatan Peninsula, where the ancestors of the Mayans began farming them, crossbreeding and cultivating dozens of different varieties, and then reintroducing the new domesticated plants to South America through trade. To this day, every tomato known to man is a descendant of this early hybrid, the outcome of pairing the Mexican varietal with the native pimps of the Andes Mountains. Anyway, in the Yucatan, as the Mayan civilization formed, tomatoes would be essential. Not a staple, I mean, those were corn, squash, and beans, but to give flavor to those staples. The Mayans called tomatoes paak, or pak, and they were eaten raw or cooked into sauces, the first versions of what we now call mole. And they loved a dish made of tomatoes pounded with pumpkin seeds and served with tortillas, called sikilpak, and still eaten in the region today. And the Mayans didn't just use tomatoes for food. They were valued by shamans who believed they gave powers of divination and fortune-telling. It's quite possible that all of the famous Mayan predictions were at the time made by using tomatoes. Anyway, as another civilization began to grow in Mexico, the Aztecs would take tomato farming to a new level, cultivating new varieties and giving the category the overall name Tomatl, technically meaning fat water, but in practice, a juicy fruit. When Hernan Cortez arrived in Tenochtitlan in 1519, he found a culture obsessed with tomatoes, given as gifts at weddings, used in religious ceremonies, and most of all, eaten as food. Tomatoes were the filling in cornmeal tamales, mixed with chili peppers and herbs to make pico de gallo and pounded with salt and chili into something meant to pair with everything, the origin of what we now call salsa. Between salsas and moles and the condiments made from chilies, the entire spectrum of Aztec cuisine would revolutionize how the world would come to view sauces. In fact, salsa, from the Latin salted and used for any kind of sauce, first shows up in writing about Mexico, and specifically related to how the people used tomatoes. And even 500 years after the Aztecs would fall, well, their food is still front and center in Mexican culture and beyond. So while there's still a long way to go in this story, this feels like the right time for us to take a break for our first meal of the day. It's been a few decades since the world fell in love with, quote, Mexican food, the nachos and chimichangas and whatever this stuff is, and finally, just in the 2020s, a new movement has taken hold, showcasing not just Tex-Mex, but the real gems of Mexico. And that means tastes and flavors that somehow aren't that different from the cuisine of the Aztecs. The restaurant called Delia in Bangkok's Chinatown is the brainchild of chef-owner Gabby Espinoza, a Mexico City native, as is head chef Diego Zarco. Both of them cooking recipes passed down through generations in the same place once called Tenochtitlan, where the outside world first encountered the tomato. Chef Diego.
Very nice to meet you.
Man, what a cool, good start to our day.
So happy to have you guys.
That's a lie. You can probably tell it's evening outside. We're filming out of order, but this restaurant's only open. Weekdays, it's only open for dinner. So cannot be more excited about what's in front of me. Chef, before we talk about tomatoes, just tell me the food that's on the table.
Okay, you have taco de pastor, one of our signatures.
Yep.
Marinated pork jowl, al pastor marinade, slowly grilled, cheese crust, some salsa roja
Yep.
with cherry tomatoes, and grilled pineapple. Then you have pollito in salsa verde. We use tomatillos and some nopales that are grown in Thailand. Confit potato, grilled chicken, and spring onion with garlic chives. Red rice to go with it. Also.
Which is cooked in?
In tomato.
There you go.
Tomato broth, yeah.
Okay.
Then you have beef tongue, lengua, that we do with some adobo. As well, we use tomato in it. Roast them until super dark in the grill. Then a mix of Mexican chilies. You have pasilla, guajillo, cook slowly. A bit of chocolate at the end. Not a mole yet. Less spices. You have refried beans with the trimmings of the beef tongue and sunchoke. Mushroom tostada with roasted cauliflower cream, grilled mushrooms, a bit of cauliflower escabeche, and salsa macha. And last but not least, the tomato salad. So we're using many different types of local tomatoes, beef tomato, cherry tomato, a smaller kind that I just got from a supplier, and a bit of cardamom shoots.
In Mexico, tomatoes were never a staple. Staples were corn, they were gourds.
Yeah, pumpkin and the bean.
Pumpkin and beans, that's it. Tomato was flavor. That was something to give a little bit of liquid, and it was something to give, in a tamale you would see tomato used as a filling, for example, in the old days, right? Or made into a sauce. That's the cool thing about tomatoes is we're not talking about rice, we're not talking about wheat, we're not talking about something that people ate to survive. People ate tomatoes
Enjoy
because
them.
they liked them, right?
Just because they're tasty.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and we're still doing that today.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Chef. I'm
Thank you so
excited to
much.
eat. Yeah, appreciate
My pleasure.
your hospitality. Congratulations on Michelin.
Thank you so much.
One quick note on the varieties of tomatoes used in Mexican cuisine, including the feast here at this restaurant. Despite the common misconception, tomatillos are a different species, related to tomatoes, but they split long before we ever started eating them. Tomatillos are used for a bit more acidity, giving flavor and color to things like salsa verde, called mil tomatl to the Aztecs, a cousin of what today we all know, and a perfect accompaniment to the dishes on the table. Talking to Chef about this. I just think it's so cool that, in Mexico, right? The food that's on this table, obviously this is an elegant or elevated version of it, but some of the techniques and recipes that we have here would be techniques and recipes that when the Spanish arrived in, like first people stepped on land in 1517, and Cortez in 1519, that when that happened, they would have seen mole sauce. They would have seen tortillas made like this and served with salsas. They would have seen, tomatillo sauce, with I think that's potato underneath it, right? So I don't know. I think Mexican food is such a gold mine for learning about stuff like this. I'm gonna take a bite.
You can't really have really good Mexican food in Asia. I mean, not that you can't, but I couldn't find any. This is great, but it's so rare.
Yeah, I mean, I never really understood that when I opened my first Mexican restaurant in China 12 years ago, I was sure that I could get the local people to kind of accept it because, the use of rice, the use of beans, the use of chilies, the slow cooked meats. I thought there was just such an overlap. But yeah, for whatever reason, that just didn't connect. Maybe I didn't make it well enough. All right. First meal of the day, at least from a video perspective. And this is where it all began.
Can I have this?
You can have whatever you want.
What is it again?
This? This is al pastor. If you've watched this channel before or read anything about food history, you probably have a good idea about the basics of the Columbian exchange. The period in time starting in 1492 when European sailors brought Old World ingredients to the Americas, introducing everything from rice to sugarcane to pigs and chickens, bringing back ships loaded with stuff previously unknown. Before this time, the people of Europe, Africa, or Asia had never tasted corn or potatoes, never smoked tobacco, and never tried chili peppers or chocolate. And indigenous Americans didn't know about citrus, garlic, bananas, or even wheat. Now, today it's easy to assume that the Columbian exchange included everything. All of the essential ingredients from both sides of the oceans slowly catching on everywhere. And today we do all mostly consume the same stuff, our basic global staples relatively universal across each continent. But the truth is the Columbian exchange missed a lot, and luck and timing played major roles in the foods that would become famous, and those that faded into obscurity. If a few things had gone differently, corn might have stayed anonymous and we'd all be eating amaranth. In parts of Mesoamerica, a much more common staple. The indigenous people of the region consumed pumpkin and avocado, but also goosefoot, a crucial ingredient finally gaining recognition in the 21st century. There were root vegetables like potatoes and sweet potatoes, and the mashua and Peruvian maca. Every region had its own native fruits, countless varieties beloved somewhere, from the uraza to the lucuma to the fascinating jaboticaba. We all know about the cacao bean, but somehow the world managed to miss out on the cupuatsu, a similar cousin but with a lighter and tangier flavor. And then there were the herbs and aromatics, diverse and abundant and completely different from anything we use today. Things like the huacate, the suma, and the epazote. If colonists had landed in different harbors or traded with different societies, maybe those would be our modern household names, sold in every grocery store. For all we know, maybe some of them did get shipped across the Atlantic, but the boat sank or they spoiled in the cargo hold and just never got the right attention. It's hard to imagine a world without the pineapple, but when that was first sent to Europe, every single specimen rotted, except for one, given to King Ferdinand II, who demanded Columbus bring back more on his next journey. Basically what I'm saying is the Columbian exchange was not a sure thing, and the stuff we take for granted today without some good fortune might not have made it at all. Which brings us to the tomato. Now it's pretty obvious that in the beginning, while colonists were going crazy over chili peppers and vanilla, tomatoes were a low priority. There's no evidence of any shipments of tomatoes across the Atlantic for almost half a century. And even after they arrived in Spain, the record goes dark again for a few more years, until they finally show up as the cause of a full-on middle-age panic. Now, I need to explain one thing that's crucial to this story. When the New World plants arrived during the Columbian exchange, they didn't show up in Europe or Asia with instruction manuals. The traders and colonists who brought them from the Americas simply sold them on the open market, and it was up to the buyer to figure out what they were and how they could be utilized. In European society, it was long believed that all of the plants on Earth belonged to a few basic categories, identified by the Greek botanist Galen as far back as the 2nd century AD. Galen explained the characteristics of everything known in his day and age, and when new fruits and vegetables arrived, starting in the 15th century. Well, at first the people looked to his work to identify what something was. This was our only frame of reference. Pretty much everybody involved in science or agriculture scoured Galen's books to find any clue about these new items, and when it came to the tomato, well, that would cause a problem. In one section of Galen's writing, he delves into mythology, detailing a fictional plant he called the Lycopersion, or wolf slayer. To Galen, it was a poisonous cousin of the very real wolfsbane, described in his stories as being yellow in color and growing from a stalk or vine. In other words, exactly like the tomatoes that arrived from Mexico. By the years of the Columbian exchange, the Lycopersion had become widely mistranslated as Lycopersicon or wolf peach, and this would be the name given to tomatoes. Now, it didn't help that this was right at the peak of what we now call the witch craze, a period spanning the 16th century when hundreds of thousands of women in Europe were executed for witchcraft. And in the literature of the era, the mythical wolf peach was the secret ingredient, allowing broomsticks to fly and turning regular people into werewolves, which might sound crazy, but at least some of the panic was justified. See, we might not think of tomatoes as poisonous, but the truth is they kind of are. So let's take a step back for a second and talk about the tomato itself. "75 million years ago, when the planet looked very different, one plant in what today is South America would evolve a defense mechanism, a kind of toxin meant to ward off insects and unwanted predators. By producing alkaloids, this plant developed a bitter taste, something that would immediately cause any herbivore to decide to stay clear and move on to something else. In time, the plant would spread, and as the continents drifted apart, it would split into several subspecies, then several more, eventually numbering nearly 3,000, and each of these would evolve independently, the toxic alkaloids adapting new characteristics to keep up with animals developing resistance. Solanine, capsaicin, nicotine, tomatine, all poisons evolved by ancestors of that first plant, an order known as nightshades. Now, while all nightshades are toxic to humans, in most cases it's mild enough not to notice. Think eggplants, okra, potatoes, and goji berries. And tomatoes. But for whatever reason, after the continental divide, the European versions would become a splinter group including some of the most deadly plants ever found in existence. There's the henbane, the toxin used in battle by the Gauls to make poison arrows. The belladonna, which once killed Augustus Caesar and was used by Shakespeare's Macbeth. And the mandrake, the terror of Greek mythology, the single most lethal fruit known to man, and a dead ringer for pre-industrial tomatoes. I mean, they look exactly the same. The first 100 years of tomato literature in Europe is roughly split between people who say not to eat it because it's poisonous, and people who say not to eat it because it's going to turn you into a werewolf. Now, obviously, tomatoes didn't disappear completely because they're still here, and that's because of one more thing about the plant's genetic structure. See, tomatoes outside the tropics are what's called annuals. They flower once, produce their fruit, and then die, the seeds taking root wherever they drop to start the cycle again. Basically, when the Spanish brought tomatoes to Europe and nobody wanted them, they would end up in wealthy homes around the port of Sevilla. But not for eating, they were used as decorations. But since they're annuals, when they started to wilt, they would get discarded, thrown away into trash piles and ditches, where after some time new plants would start to grow in their place. Eventually, these would grow their own fruits, and Sevilla's peasants saw animals feeding on them and not dying, so they started bringing them home. At first, since nobody knew how to use tomatoes, the Spanish would cook them like eggplants, sautéed with a little bit of salt and garlic. But soon enough, new recipes would show up, utilizing the tomato to make rich stews and sauces, and the culinary world would never be the same. And that brings us to our next meal. This is, I believe, our 110th full-length video here on OTR, and somehow, at least as far as I can remember, we have never managed to work in a Spanish meal before today. Maybe we just didn't think of it because it's too obvious. Daria's family lives in Spain and this is her comfort food. Or maybe it's because until today we didn't know about this restaurant. A brand new Barcelona-style tapas place earning accolades under the guidance of managing partner Ricardo Laferia. So as much as I want to talk about food, let's start with talking about the tomato, because that's the whole point of this video.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, I'm looking at this and I keep forgetting that this is even a tomato video. I'm like, I want to try everything. But when we're talking about the tomato, coming from Spain, you know, it was a 200-year head start on anybody else in Europe, right? And this is, obviously it's something that's important in Spanish cuisine. You come to Thailand, you couldn't find the tomatoes you wanted.
Exactly.
What did you do?
Well, basically, I found the seeds from my seed supplier. Actually, it was my mom who told me, you need to go to this seed supplier. And basically, I brought Barbastro, which is one of the biggest tomatoes that we have. But we have also Cordebo. We have also Nas de Bruxa, which is the long one. Nas de Bruxa means the witch nose.
Witch's nose,
Yeah, witch's nose, right? So here we have a sample of the three of them together, okay? And we just add extra virgin olive oil and this vinegar that is aged for 24 months. It's a sherry vinegar.
Can you tell me, first of all, so I'm going to talk about one of my pet peeves very quickly, which is you see on menus at every Spanish restaurant or any tapas restaurant around the world,
Yeah.
tomato bread.
Yeah.
Right? But it's been since I was in Barcelona, which is now 11 years ago, the last time I was there, that I've seen it actually made looking like this.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be a saucy piece of toast.
Not at all.
This is such a simple thing, but it's so important in Barcelona, in Catalonian cuisine.
Yeah.
Tell me what this is.
Well, originally it's from Catalonia, the pan con tomate, right? The pan tumacat, we call it in Catalonia. This is the proper way to do it. The rest is an atrocity, you know? I mean, blend the tomato with the skin and everything and just put it like this with a spoon. Bro, don't do that, please, okay? It's so easy. Just cut it, scrape it, salt, and a good olive oil. Simple as that.
All right, well, in the interest of having a happy partner, Daria, over there, as much as I'd like to sit here and talk to you all day, she is looking at me like she's going to kill me if we don't start eating the food.
Let's go.
So I'm going to throw her in here and let's
go.
start eating. Thank
Please.
you so much, Chef.
Daria, come here.
Appreciate it. Muchas gracias. Before we get too bogged down in food, I was thinking one thing we didn't talk about is why Spain didn't reject tomatoes like everybody else did. And that was because the Spanish Inquisition actually made it illegal to believe in superstitions. So this whole thing about like witchcraft and all this was outlawed in Spain. And so at the time that everyone else was going crazy, is it good? Anyway, there's the story. I'm gonna eat. So yeah, it was good. The right place, the right time in Spain, and especially at first in Sevilla, where the first ones arrived. Let's just shut up and eat. All right, Dennis, get the shots you need, and please join us and eat. You know, I would say there's plenty of food, but we might actually just smash all of this before you even stop filming. So let's get back to the story.
That's insane. It's so good.
It's so good. It would take a very long time for tomatoes to gain acceptance outside Spain across the rest of Europe. But the Spanish didn't just trade on their own continent. In 1565, Spain would colonize the Philippines and begin a route back and forth from Acapulco, Mexico, what we now call the Spanish Galleon. Now, galleon trade was relatively simple. The Spanish loaded ships with luxury products from Asia, stuff like jade and Chinese silks, Indian textiles and Indonesian spices, and sent them across the Pacific in exchange for silver, mined in abundance in the Mexican colony. Contrary to popular belief, foods were not a major part of the galleon trade. It was literally just expensive stuff for silver. But each boat carried as many as 500 crew members, of whom all but the captain were usually Filipino. And that crew would spend at least 3 months on each mission in Mexico waiting for the trade winds to change. So gradually, we see Mexican flavors start to find an audience among Filipino sailors, who'd bring back ingredients from the New World and cultivate them in the Philippines. Because of this direct exchange of culture, while the Europeans called tomatoes wolf peaches, the Filipinos adapted the native Aztec word of tomatl, pronouncing this kamatis, which to this day is still the term used in the Philippines. By the end of the 16th century, kamatis was incorporated into Filipino cuisine, utilized in a foundational mixture called guisado along with onions and garlic, cooked into soups like sinigang and caldereta and used to flavor sausawan, their own adaptation of Mexican salsa. But just like how Spanish tomatoes didn't win over the rest of Europe, other Asian countries weren't interested either when they saw them in Manila, scared off again by nightshades. They did have some value as a rare ornamental, showing up in a few foreign palaces, and we can track where they went by the names. The Chinese were the first known buyers of Filipino tomatoes, calling them fangqie, or the eggplant of the barbarians. They'd grow them for beauty and sell them onwards to places like Vietnam, which would call them phienza, or also barbarian eggplants. The Thais of Ayutthaya were a little bit more polite, using ma kua tet, the eggplant of foreigners. Same with the Indians and the name Vilayati bangan. And in Japan, well, they would be akanasu, or eggplants of a red color. Now, many of these names would change a long time later, but in general across Asia, wherever tomatoes were named after eggplants, they came from China, by way of the Philippines and Spain. In Europe, well, just like in the Philippines, the Spanish kept the Aztec name, calling them Tomatl. But also like in Asia, the first buyers compared them to something else that they already knew. Not eggplants, but apples, specifically the deadly one that came from the Garden of Eden. The Italians in 1544 were the first to record purchase of decorative tomatoes, naming them pomomella, or the poison apple. This, by the way, would later become the golden apple, or pomodoro, still used in modern Italy. In France, they'd be called pomme d'amour, or love apples, not out of romance, but as a reference to Adam and Eve. The English would also use the name love apples, and in Germany and Austria, they were Paradiesapfel, or the apples of paradise, because just like in Eden, they were meant to be seen, but never touched. It's hard to overstate how feared tomatoes were across the old world. There are 16th century textbooks from France that say a single bite of the love apple would provoke intense loathing and vomiting, and in England, where they were said to be rank, stinking, and morally corrupt. And as if it couldn't get any worse, well, at some point, a few British aristocrats decided to be brave and try tomatoes. And then they died, actually. Now, today we know it wasn't because of the tomatoes, but rather the reaction of the acid with their expensive pewter plates, which caused intense lead poisoning. But as far as Europe was concerned, the stories were true. And even as late as the 18th century, well, the founder of taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus, would endow tomatoes with the official scientific name of Solanum lycopersicum, the wolf peach. Anyway, for a long time it seemed like tomatoes were destined to end up like the amaranth or jaboticaba, another New World ingredient missed by the Columbian exchange. It was fading fast into obscurity, but something was about to happen that would change the fortunes of the wolf peach forever. 150 years after the first Italian reference to the poison apple, we see the first recipe for tomatoes as an ingredient. It shows up in 1692 as a guide for tomato sauce, a foreign dish referred to in Italy as alla spagnola, or cooked in the Spanish style. The Italian style would show up sometime in the next few decades in the city of Naples, which was, until the end of the 18th century, a Spanish possession. We don't know how tomatoes were first brought to Naples, but we do know why they would catch on fast. Because of the rich volcanic soil of Mount Vesuvius, tomatoes would thrive beyond anything the Old World had seen before. The fields of San Marzano soon enough covered in plants bearing fruits of the deepest red color and the most vibrant flavor. We first find out about this development from wealthy foreign visitors, teenagers of prominent European families who participated in what was then called the Grand Tour, a rite of passage visiting the great sites of the Italian Renaissance. Around the 1750s, Grand Tourists began writing of something captivating, a flatbread served in Naples topped with tomato sauce, what we now call pizza. And this would change everything. Before long, stopping for Neapolitan pizza became as essential as visiting the art galleries of Rome, and even Thomas Jefferson, the American ambassador to France, took note of this phenomenon and paid a visit, recording recipes and bringing San Marzano tomato seeds back with him to Monticello. And it wouldn't just be pizza that would become a sensation. After the harvest, locals would lay the tomatoes on their rooftops to dry and then jar them in olive oil, the beginning of sun-dried tomatoes. And by 1790, local cookbooks included recipes for a style of spaghetti called pasta pomodoro, which would be followed by more and more new tomato pastas, first in Naples, and then across the rest of Italy. Now, two things would happen simultaneous to the rise of tomatoes in Naples that would eventually bring the plant to the world, and cause old superstitions to finally fade away. The first was the influence of the Grand Tourists, who would encourage their own aristocratic families to cultivate tomatoes in France, England, and the Netherlands. And the second Well, that begins with a man named Lazzaro Spallanzani, who, if you'll allow me a quick digression, lived such an epic life he deserves a moment in the spotlight. Mr. Spallanzani, if you can't guess from the name, was Italian, born and raised in Emilia-Romagna. At first, he joined the seminary but found himself fascinated by science, taken on as a protege by Laura Bassi, the first woman doctor of sciences ever, and the first recorded female university professor in world history. And while her own story is fascinating, that would be a double digression. So back to Lazzaro Spallanzani. Anyway, he would go on to become a professor himself, teaching logic, metaphysics, and ancient Greek. And whenever he had a chance, he would travel, documenting rare phenomenon and unknown plants and animals across the Mediterranean and as far away as Russia and Scandinavia. Over time, his classes would become so popular that crowds gathered hundreds deep outside buildings whenever he would come to lecture. And so the University of Pavia recruited him with the promise of the first recorded example ever of paid sabbatical, encouraging him to take time off to keep doing cool stuff. And that he would. Among his breakthroughs were basically creating the fields of volcanology and meteorology, and he even identified the science behind skipping stones. And in 1762, he invented canned tomatoes. Basically, Spallanzani discovered that if you boiled tomatoes and then sealed them in an airtight container, they would preserve for years without losing any flavor. He never profited from this invention, but within a few decades, a lot of other Italians would. And because of the reputation of the crops from Naples, San Marzanos were being canned and sent abroad. And soon enough, anyone, anywhere could recreate the legendary Neapolitan pizza. And while there's still a long way to go in this story, well, I can't think of a better excuse to take a break for our next meal. All right, today is turning into an embarrassment of culinary riches. We should just do every video on tomatoes. This is a restaurant called Peppina, the celebrated home of Chef Tanwa, better known as M, the first Thai native certified by the AVPN, the ultra-prestigious authority governing true Neapolitan pizza. Chef M is a pizza legend, raised as an immigrant in Naples and working his way up through centuries-old pizza kitchens. In 2019, he finished in the top 3 of the actual Naples Pizza Olympics. And since coming back to Bangkok, well, he's seen Peppina honored as the best place for pizza in all of Southeast Asia, top 50 in the entire world. And of course, well, here the tomatoes are flown in fresh from the farms of Mount Vesuvius.
Allora, questo è il pienolo tomato del Vesuvio. Questo viene da Napoli, quindi nell'area vulcanica di Napoli. Questo si chiama il pienolo. Invece questa è la conosciamo tutti, quindi è la San Marzano. Quindi c'ha la forma lunga e cresce sempre nell'area vulcanica di zona Campania di Napoli. Sì.
But why is it so important, for example, for a proper, when Italian immigrants moved to the United States, they had to import tomatoes to get the right flavor. What is this? And yeah, in Thailand, you're importing these.
Okay.
What makes this, both of these, but especially the San Marzanos, what's the taste that makes them so special?
Ok, the taste, il sapore e la semplicità. Questa noi, siccome noi facciamo la vera pizza napoletana, verace, quindi il prodotto deve essere originale. So, questo è un San Marzano che c'è un sapore delicato, dolce. Invece questo pienolo è molto sugosa, dolce e molto saporito. Allora abbiamo la pizza, questa lo chiamiamo pizza peppina, c'è quindi la base pomodoro San Marzano, bufala, la mozzarella di bufala e il piennolo, tomato. Questa è la fettuccini, ragù di salsicce e porcini, il fettuccine fatto in casa. Poi abbiamo la bruschetta di pomodoro, quindi usiamo i pomodori freschi organico di Chiang Mai. E questa è la burrata caprese, la classica. La burrata viene da Andria, in Puglia, in Italia. Il pomodoro da Chiang Mai organico. Quindi usiamo tutti i prodotti organici e importati.
All right, let's eat.
That's it? No introduction?
Let's eat first. I'm looking
I mean,
at
not
this.
that I disagree with that.
I was gonna say, this is one of those that you wanna get while it is warm.
Can I start with the
You can
The
start
best
with
sellers?
whatever you want. Can you pizza me actually? Can you hand me a slice?
I can
Um,
oh, I'm gonna
I'm going to gloss over this since we covered it in our History of Bread video, but pizza might have started as a Persian flatbread adapted by Neapolitans to include tomatoes, but the worldwide craze began in 1889 with one specific recipe, made in Naples by a local chef in honor of a visit from Queen Margherita. The colors of the Italian flag, red, green, and white, tomato, basil, and mozzarella. The birth of Italy's classic, but more than that, the introduction of the idea that a pizza should contain tomato sauce and cheese, a concept that would sweep across the planet, but to this day, well, none have surpassed the original.
Am I gonna get cancelled if I use a knife with my pizza? Just imagine
That's
the
not
hate. The hate.
There's a lot of reasons you might get canceled. That's not high at the top of the list. Do what you want. Yeah, man, this is so good. You know, it's a classic thing you talk about, like Columbian exchange. The first thing everybody always says is like, what would Thai food, Chinese food be without chili peppers? What would Italian food be without tomatoes? And like, you know, Italian food is a broad, diverse category with a lot of great stuff. But yeah, you know, they talk about mastering one ingredient. Guys, come eat while it's
Was
warm.
it the soil? Is it the soil or what?
Say the soil and the creativity of the people. The
Well,
love,
you say
it's
like
the love.
we don't do stereotypes and you do this.
Let's eat. In the late 18th century, with San Marzano tomatoes now available, Europe was suddenly torn by a fundamental debate. Was the chance to enjoy pizza and pasta worth the risk of turning into a werewolf? This would come to the forefront in Russia in 1780 when Catherine the Great was presented with fresh San Marzanos, a gift from an Italian ambassador. This horrified the Orthodox Church, but against their advice, she tried them and loved the flavor, telling her top advisor, Andrei Bolotov, to make a plan to start their cultivation. And lucky for her, Mr. Bolotov was not particularly religious, so on the spot he admitted that he was already growing tomatoes in secret, just outside Moscow. When wealthy Parisians in France developed a taste for Italian tomatoes, they also found there was a domestic supply. Southerners around Provence had been growing their own version for a generation. And by the end of the French Revolution, Provençal tomato dishes like bouillabaisse and ratatouille were exploding across the capital. In England, tomatoes would enter cuisine around 1797, the first time we see reference to UK consumption of the ingredient. And as Londoners gained a taste for tomatoes, while they would take off in popularity, thanks to the advent of glasshouse farming. Tomatoes were perfectly suited for the humidity of these new structures. Among the British swept up in the excitement was a man named John Barker, who in 1799 would be sent to Aleppo as diplomatic consul. In Syria, he devoted himself to introducing tomatoes, which would spread across the rest of the Ottoman Empire. And then Barker would repeat this again in North Africa when he was transferred to Egypt. Barker gets credit for bringing tomatoes to a big part of the world. But when the plant would move west from Egypt, crossing Libya and Algeria, while in Morocco they would find a culture already growing them, a legacy of the Moors who had carried them back from Spain. These Moroccan tomatoes eventually found their way to Senegal, where the local people used them in an old delicacy made from rice and fish. With the new addition, jollof rice would take off throughout West Africa, and by the end of the century, this was the signature dish of the entire region. But of all the innovations that would follow the mass acceptance of tomatoes, there was one that would stand above the rest and elevate the plant to a global cash crop. In 1567, after 2 centuries in isolation, the Chinese Ming dynasty lifted a ban on foreign trade, and for the first time ever, European ships began arriving in the Middle Kingdom. At the southern ports of Guangzhou, Xiamen, and Quanzhou, British traders encountered a kind of seasoning, something we all know today as fish sauce, the main condiment used across East and Southeast Asia. At the time, in Mandarin Chinese, this was known as xiezhi, or fermented fish. In the coastal dialect of Fujian province, the same 2 characters were pronounced ketchup. Before long, the British sailors were using ketchup to season their foods, but when they brought it back to England, well, the general public was not sold on the funky and aggressively salty flavor. So cooks began experimenting with other ingredients, the name ketchup sticking around to describe any fermented condiment. There would be versions of ketchup made from mushrooms, walnuts, elderberries, plums, and even for the posh crowd, oysters pickled in expensive white wine. But ketchup would not truly hit the mainstream until British colonists took the concept along to the Americas. The first record of anyone using tomatoes to make a ketchup was a Philadelphia doctor named James Meese. His invention wouldn't take off, but it did gain fans in Pennsylvania, including a few decades later a horseradish salesman named Henry Heinz. With his company in trouble and needing a boost in revenue, Mr. Heinz decided to try bottling tomato ketchup, using his own recipe including vinegar, salt, and sugar. And since the end result was a vibrant red color, he packaged it in clear glass bottles. Heinz tomato ketchup would launch in 1876 and become an immediate hit, quickly sweeping its way across the country. As a side note, by the way, just 4 years later in 1880, a financial crisis would hit Italy, and a wave of migration would begin, nearly 6 million Italians fleeing to America. The Italians would set up businesses in cities like New York and Boston, importing mass quantities of San Marzanos to use for their pizzas and pastas. Meanwhile, American tomato farming was thriving to meet demand for ketchup, and this is why just 3 years later, the U.S. farmers sued to block imported competition, which would lead to the Supreme Court case we mentioned at the very beginning of this video. Anyway, as for China, the country where ketchup first began, well, they would be among the last to actually accept tomatoes. But in the end, they would get there, thanks of all things to a Chinese Catholic priest, who in 1840 left his home in Shanxi province to study at a seminary in, of course, Naples. Wang Tingrong would be so captivated by San Marzanos that he would stay in Italy for another decade, learning the finer points of tomato cultivation. Then he'd come back to China and spend the rest of his life evangelizing his favorite plant. Mr. Wang gets credit for introducing China to tomato farming, but as for its use in cuisine, well, that would come a short time later, arriving almost simultaneously from the East and the West. The first story starts in North Africa not long after the days of John Barker, when a new dish shows up in Tunisia called shakshuka, made with tomato and eggs along with onion, garlic, and spices. What pizza did for tomatoes in Europe, shakshuka would achieve throughout the Muslim world, sweeping across the Arabian Peninsula and then into Turkey, Iran, and Central Asia. And then China, evolving in Xinjiang into a tomato and egg stir-fry. And simultaneous to all of this, in the 1870s, the Japanese Meiji government was racing to modernize the national cuisine, and this included importing a whole bunch of Heinz ketchup, soon enough incorporated into dozens of new yoshiku dishes. Ketchup, which started in China, would be reintroduced into Shanghai by the Japanese, and there would be no slowing down the growth of tomatoes in China. Now, this would not come without some controversy. Seeing the introduction of so many new dishes, and especially Chinese ketchup bastardized as a foreign creation, traditionalists started pushing back. In the 1930s, the legendary novelist Lao She summed up the old generation's feelings, writing that tomatoes were causing no less than the loss of Chinese national identity. He decried tomatoes as a cultural invasion and even, and I quote, as destructive to China's way of life as the Opium Wars. But unfortunately for him and other skeptics, the tomato was there to stay. And so we might as well take a break for some ketchup and a plate of Chinese tomato and eggs. All right, so tomato and egg soup, tomato and eggs, and the guobaro, so basically sweet and sour fried pieces of pork. Sweet and sour sauce uses ketchup, at least in a modern restaurant presentation, and then the disancian, which is not tomato related, but that brings us to the restaurant that we're at. We wanted to do this in part because it fits the storyline, but also there's a restaurant in Bangkok that we haven't tried before called Dalian.
Dalian.
Which is where Daria went to school, got her master's degree. You lived for what, 6 years in Dalian? Mm-hmm. So, does it look authentic?
I'm gonna be very judgmental of this food. This is a serious business right now.
Honestly speaking, as a poor, starving college student, this was probably something that you had once or twice.
Every day.
The,
2 kwai. How much is it in the...
10 baht, US dollars, that is 30 cents,
30
20,
cents
25 cents?
on the
I don't know.
rice.
US dollar's not doing very well right now. I don't know, my internal comparisons I need to kind of maybe think through again. But yeah, so there you go.
When you like Dalian Santin, can I start?
You can start. Let's have it with some rice.
It's very ketchup. It's nice.
Does it taste like Dalian? So Chris and Steph from Chinese Cooking Demystified did a video on what sweet and sour sauce was before they started adding ketchup to it. I don't think it used to use tomatoes. I don't think I watched that video. Sorry, Chris. But yeah, I watch that one if you want to know what sweet and sour sauce actually used to be. But now, if you have it in a restaurant, it is almost guaranteed to use ketchup. How does it compare to actual Dalian? How does Dalian Restaurant compare to restaurants in Dalian?
Again, it's really good. I don't think I had the best version of Dalian food in Dalian since, as you said, I was a student and I had like the cheapest cafeteria one, like 100% time. But yeah, no, this is very authentic. This is great. This is good. This is very ketchupy.
So it's so interesting, this whole shakshuka thing. You know, in China, you never viewed this as being a shakshuka equivalent. You can get that at foreign restaurants. Tomato and eggs is tomato and eggs. But like, when you actually kind of track this dish, there are equivalents of this even in Thailand, and it came through Chinese Muslims, right? So from Yunnan province, there's that group called the Chinha, which is a completely different story, fascinating kind of. That's where khao soi comes from, for example, is a Thai dish, Chinha culture. But the tomato and egg dish, Mick, our friend from Doi Kanoi in Vientiane, he was just in a rural village in northern Laos where there's a Chinha community, and he was posting pictures on his Instagram of this dish at a village in Laos, you know, coming through Chinese Muslims. It's such a fascinating thing to kind of track this. And it's fun to eat. Not purists. If you're a traditionalist, I can understand how the Chinese writer Lao She, how he looked at this as ruining Chinese culture. I think.
Did he? Yes.
Yeah, I think Chris and Steph might agree with it. This is not Chris's favorite dish. Remember, he wanted to do this as an April Fool's Day dish to cook.
not
the magic
ruining the
of
culture.
the 5,000-year magic in the history of Chinese cuisine, and then we have this tomato and egg stir fry. But
It's delicious. It's nutritious. It does the job.
there you go. All right, Dennis, come eat. Still have a little bit of a ways to go in our story. By the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had changed the way we eat. Instead of taking meals at home, workers now looked for stuff to grab on the go, which would be a boon to things like sandwiches and pizza. And with women also entering the workplace, even family dinners now had to adapt, and a new industry would take off selling ready-made foods, stuff you could just heat up and put on the table. But there was one product that manufacturers couldn't figure out how to scale. Soups, since the beginning of time, had been a mainstay around the world, but canning them did not work financially because putting a giant amount of liquid into a single container led to ridiculous shipping costs and took up so much shelf space that grocery stores refused to stock them. But in 1897, a young man from Camden, New Jersey had an idea. His name was John T. Dorrance, and his uncle Arthur co-owned a tomato farm. While Arthur focused on developing new varieties, his nephew was experimenting in the kitchen and noticed that if you boiled tomatoes, well, they would keep reducing without losing color or flavor quality. All that happened was the taste became more intense. He started playing around with making condensed tomato soup, which could theoretically be packaged in reasonably sized cans and thinned out with water at home. When Dorrance felt like the product was ready, he pitched it to his uncle's business partner, Joseph Campbell, and thus was born the world's first concentrated product, Campbell's tomato soup. The next big commercial breakthrough would come a few years later in a tiny village in Indiana that would one day become known as the hometown of Larry Bird. The French Lick Springs Hotel was setting up for the day's continental breakfast, but the chef realized there were no oranges to make juice. So he pivoted and blended up some tomatoes, then strained it and served it as a special. The guests were impressed, and the hotel would become the first to package and sell tomato juice. This product would work its way across the country, reaching New York City by 1930, where someone started mixing it with vodka, a combination now called the Bloody Mary. I say someone because 3 different Manhattan bars claim credit for the invention. As for the Canadian version, the Caesar, well, that's a little bit less controversial. That started in 1969 when a bartender from Calgary took a trip to Naples and came up with a drink based on spaghetti alla vognole. Anyway, with tomato juice going mainstream, a company from Illinois would patent their own version, which they would call V8. This blend of fruits and vegetables would get bought out in 1948 by Campbell's Soup Company, which hired a celebrity pitchman for a national ad campaign, a popular actor named Ronald Reagan. V8 would find a wide audience thanks to marketing, but also because tomato juice became the go-to drink on airplanes, something actually based on science. At high altitudes, it's hard to taste anything sweet or salty, but umami, like tomatoes, well, that gets amplified. By the 1960s, canned tomato juice was the most common beverage served in the air, after just water and coffee. And of all the legacies of the growth of tomato juice, well, maybe the most surprising is that it would end up being the reason why the world's last remaining holdout finally gave in and accepted the inevitable. You might have noticed that in this entire video, we have not yet mentioned the country of India, usually at the forefront of any culinary innovation, but in the case of tomatoes, well, India was a hard no. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that was the case. Part of it was animosity towards the British, who tried to introduce it in the years after John Barker, but found no interest from the general public. There were also cultural factors. Since tomato products like canned San Marzanos and American ketchup came from abroad, India's upper castes saw them as violating a prohibition on diluting local traditions. And of course, there was also a religion, with nightshades like tomatoes associated with evil. If we fast forward to the 1930s, across the ocean, the United States was in the middle of the Great Depression, and with starvation widespread, doctors began suggesting tomato juice as a cure for malnutrition. The idea was that since it contained so much vitamin A and C, potassium and magnesium, tomato juice should be a daily drink. With India in its own hunger crisis, a group of physicians set out to convince the public to give tomato juice a chance. A 1938 symposium led by a doctor named Tara Chitale would gain some attention, but only after independence would the plant truly take off. In the aftermath of the partition, two brothers from what's now Pakistan would settle in Delhi and open a restaurant called Moti Mahal. To gain attention, they'd create a menu of their own signature dishes, including, for the first time, tomato-based curries. Buttered chicken would become a Delhi sensation, as would its cousins, spin-off dishes like paneer butter masala. With the success of these new delicacies, well, finally, 450 years after the start of the Columbian Exchange, tomatoes were officially everywhere. Today, it's estimated that of the 193 UN-recognized countries, tomatoes are grown commercially in 170, with the top 5 producers representing 4 different continents. There are by now 10,000 recognized varieties of tomatoes, from the ancient fruits of the Andes Mountains to San Marzanos, to today's bestseller, the cherry tomato, invented by Israeli scientists in the 1970s under contract from Marks and Spencer. Thanks to fast food French fries, ketchup would become one of the world's best-selling condiments, dominating sales in the United States until falling to number 2 in 1991, knocked off of all things by salsa. The oldest tomato dish we know on Earth, all of a sudden a modern favorite. Around the world, we eat as much as 20 kilograms of tomatoes per person per year, on average, with turkey at the top of the list, and if that sounds familiar, that's the 3rd time it's happened in an OTR video. Turkey also in the top spot for bread and tea. The Turks don't mess around. Statistically speaking, tomatoes are the world's highest-selling fruit, 190 billion metric tons harvested every year, and the tomato economy is still growing and showing no signs of slowing down. From sandwiches to salads, condiments to beverages, tomatoes are unavoidable. They're everywhere, from one side of the planet to the other. And since so far none of us have turned into werewolves, well, we might as well finish with one more meal and one more bite of tomatoes. So long. Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to everyone who supports us on Patreon. It really helps to keep us going. Find links below for our Patreon and social media, and we'll see you soon. One thing that's kind of fun is the fact that we're talking about the language, right? And Fangtia, the first Chinese name for tomatoes, was the barbarian eggplant. Mm. So that word evolved, and by the time Chinese people started actually eating tomatoes, it was the Western red persimmon, xihongshi. But Fangtia still exists for ketchup. So ketchup is Fangtia jiang. So sauce made with barbarian eggplant is still the term for ketchup, maybe because we who make the ketchup are barbarians. But yeah, that word still exists. So fangtia can still be used for tomatoes, but in the sauce context, the fruit itself is.
And we have the same in Russia. Tomato paste, tomato, tomate, pomidorki.
There you go.
Pomidorki.
Xihongshi. That's the hardest word for me to say.
Xihongshi. Why?
So, xihongshi. When I was working my first restaurant job in China, my sous chef, it was 2 of us in the kitchen. So it was me and an older lady from Hunan province. And that was how I basically learned to speak Chinese. It was my first job in China. And she was from Hunan, the dialect. Remember, you know how I always say this. It's xihongsi.
Yeah, you say it in the
so
weirdest
that's
way.
But that's I can't not, I have to get myself to slow down. Xihongshi. It's so unnatural to me. It's just xihongsi. But you always look at me like I'm the biggest sort of Nongmin village farmer when I say that.
I remember when we moved in China from north to south, and everybody understood you, but nobody understood me because my Chinese was too biaojun.